Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry for being a little bit late too. This is our first broadcast, so we are getting off to a late start. Hopefully, we'll be up and ready as we continue on our study. So thank you for being here, and we will get started with the first of our Messianic Jewish studies of Philippians. My name is Sean Emslie, and I will be your teacher through this time. We'll be going through the book of Philippians, one of the lesser known books of the Apostle Paul, or Rav Shaul, as someone know him. And this is the first initiative of a new Messianic Jewish organization, Letter to Philippi, that is actually launching today. This is our first initiative. Our organization was formed in April of this year, and this is our first initiative that we're doing. Is going to be doing the daily study through the book of Philippians, Paul's letter to Philippi, and we'll also be adding on. I'll start doing trying to do weekly, but at least 2 or 3 times a month, putting out a Messianic Jewish look at various books that are currently out on the issues of Messianic Judaism related books about Paul within the Jewish context, and looking at these books that are out there in the larger academic world, and bringing the knowledge of these books to a wider audience, and also to show how these books are useful for building a solid Messianic Jewish theology and Messianic Judaism for the future. So again, my name is Sean Emslie. I'll be your teacher. We'll be going through verse by verse for the book of Philippians. There are 103 verses. We'll be doing about one or two verses a day. So this will be about a 2-month journey that we'll be going on together. And we'll be here on our website, lettertophilippi.org, which we invite you to visit. Also on Facebook Live, and also on Instagram Live. So we are streaming live each day, Monday through Friday, at 12 p.m. Pacific time on, as I said, both our website, lettertophilippi.org, Facebook Live, and also Instagram Live. So with that, I'd like to welcome you to this first initiative of lettertophilippi.org, and this new work to build a 21st century Messianic Jewish theology, and to build a Messianic Judaism that is grounded on a strong biblical and biblically based theology of who Yeshua is and how we live our lives as Jewish followers of Messiah Yeshua. So one of my favorite verses in the Bible comes from Philippians chapter 1, verses 21, which we'll be looking at in a couple weeks, which according to the Complete Jewish Bible reads, "For to me, life is the Messiah and death is gain." These powerful words from Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, that to him, everything about his life is Messiah Yeshua. And even if he was to die, he was facing execution under Nero, knowing that he had the certain possibility of his execution coming. He was also realizing that's not the difficult thing for him. That would be instantly being with Messiah, but living on would be the more difficult task. Living on in this world, waiting for that time that he will be united with the Messiah. So the book of Philippians, it kind of gets lost in there between the larger books of the Brit Hadashah, the New Covenant, with the Gospels and Romans, Galatians, and the Philippians letters. But in between, after those letters, there are the smaller letters, which are called Paul's prison letters, and which he wrote in his in different times in imprisonment. This being one of them, and believed to be one of his last letters written from his time in prison in Rome. So in this small letter, as my dear friend and mentor Dewey Bertolini called the a lovely little letter, a lovely little book of Philippians, because though it's small, 4 chapters, 103 verses, we see some powerful lessons we can learn as Messianic Jews and those who are seeking to follow the God of Israel, both Jew and Gentile, can see in this letter that though small, it packs a powerful punch in teaching us about modeling our lives and being as Rav Shul, as Paul says, to be like the Messiah. And this letter, so Paul begins his letter to the Philippians, showing his deep love for this Messianic community. The love that he has for them is grounded in their love for him and participation in this work of ministry. This is a unique letter in that it's really a love letter from Paul to this community that means so much to him. As we see in other letters like Romans and Galatians, there's a sense of, and the Corinthian letters, there's a sense of Paul looking to go after, speak harshly about issues of division and sin in the communities. And that was the basis of his letters, to confront problems, whether it be the issues in Galatia of the false teachings about requiring the Gentile believers to be circumcised, or issues of sin within the leadership community in Corinth. But this letter is written with a deep sense of love for the Philippians, and not to say that there isn't love in confronting sin, that is love, but also here but this deep affection for this community built on their faithfulness and based on their following his way of life that he taught them. So this letter was written to Philippi. Philippi was a city in Greece, in modern day Greece. And it was actually the first city in Europe that Paul brought the message of Yeshua. So this was it can be said that by Paul going to Philippi, which you can read about in Acts 16, that this was the uttermost parts of the earth at that time. It was the European continent, specifically the end of the world being what we know as modern day Spain. So in going to Philippi in Acts 16, Paul was basically opening up the uttermost parts of the world from our righteous Messiah's command to go to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. This was the beginning of the real entering the uttermost part of the world, which would have been Europe at that time. With this launch in the primary Gentile world, Paul called coming to Philippi the early days of my work, spreading the good news when I left Macedonia. And he mentions that in Philippians chapter 4:15, which we'll look at in a couple months. But Paul understands that now he is really going into the uttermost parts of the world, and sees this as the real beginning of his most important work, being that the spread to the primarily Gentile world. One of the most familiar verses of the letter, which I mentioned earlier, is verse 21 of chapter 1, where Paul stresses the centrality of Yeshua in his life. Paul's whole life, from his encounter with Yeshua on the road to Damascus, from his execution under Nero, was all about knowing Messiah more and more, and becoming, as he said, frequently to be in Messiah. Paul will further discuss the centrality of Yeshua throughout this letter, with this being the first and foremost of a proclamation of Yeshua being a source of life now and into eternity. And as he demonstrates them of himself, the centrality of Yeshua in his life, he commends that to us, that we will also, like him, be totally in Messiah. So today we'll be looking at the first verse of the first chapter. It's the opening greetings of Paul's letter to Philippi, and we will, as I said, we'll be taking some time going through this letter. I figure it could be a couple months that we'll be going through this, but this will be our daily time together, and As I said, if you miss a week, you can watch the video on our website, lettertophilippi.org. But now let's get into looking at the first verse of chapter 1 of the book of Philippians. And we read from Shaul and Timothy, slaves of the Messiah, to all God's people, united with Messiah Yeshua and living in Philippi, along with the congregation leaders and shamashim, deacons. So he begins in this letter, as most letters begin, with a salutation. As anyone, as you send a letter, you usually say, dear John, or dear Paul, or dear Susan. Paul here, in following the dictates of his time and the way that letters written, begins with this: from Shaul and Timothy, slaves of the Messiah Yeshua. And then he goes to speak about the community of Philippi. So we begin with his opening words, from Shaul. The writer of this letter is the Apostle Paul, also known as Shaul or Rav Shaul. As you read through the Complete Jewish Bible Translation, Dr. Stern uses Rav Shaul throughout it for the references to Paul in the Brit Hadashah. Shaul was his Hebrew or synagogue name, and the name that he would have been given in his Brit Milah as his bris. And like other Jews at the time, he would also adopt a Greco-Roman second name, which he chose Paulus, which is a similar sounding to Saul, or in English we have it as Paul. The second Gentile name was usually chosen based on a similar sound or other relationship to the Hebrew name. It says Saul, Paul, Shaul, Paulus. There's a similar sound. A similar name practice occurs today by Gentiles who convert to Judaism, or Jews who are not raised religiously when they adopt a Jewish name related to their birth name. For example, Reuben for Robert, or Shoshana for Susan. And when I became into my connection, my conversion to Judaism, my given name is Sean, and I chose Yochanan, which is the comparative name. Yochanan or John is the base name, where Sean comes. Sean is the Irish rendering of the name Yochanan. So starting in Acts 13:9, we encounter Paul's two names. Then Shaul, also known as Paul, filled with the Ruach HaKodesh, stared straight at him. From this point forward in Paul, Luke refers to Shaul by his Greco-Roman name, Paul. It's interesting, this verse here, that the verse begins that Luke, in writing in the book of Acts here, he says, then Shaul, also known as Paul, filled with the Ruach HaKodesh, stared straight at him. From this point forward in Acts, Luke refers to Shaul by his Greco-Roman name, Paul. Also, and it's interesting here that from this point on really begins the real work of moving toward the primarily Gentile world. So in being able to be more in context with the Greek world, Paul from this point on goes by his Greek name, which would be more familiar to the people of that time, and to the people that he would be encountering in Macedonia. The name change from Shaul to Paul in Acts can be understood as marking a shift of focus and field of service. From Shaul, the Jewish disciple, to Paul, the apostle Messiah, the whole world. His globally recognized name reflecting his global mission. And this contrast, this idea that his change in name was a matter of him taking on his new responsibility of focusing on bringing the good news of the Messiah to the Gentile world, is in contrast to the common teaching, which I've seen in various teachings and also in videos where where they talk about, well, Paul changed his name because he went from Shaul the Jew to Paul the Christian. No, it's not a matter of him going from being a Jew to becoming a Christian, but a matter of that the name change of him primarily going by Paul was to reflect his new mission to the Gentile world. We also see this letter comes from Timothy, and he says, and Timothy. Timothy is one of Paul's most loyal co-workers who joined Paul as he began his second journey to Asia Minor. The purpose of this journey was to share the rulings of the Jerusalem Council, which you read about in Acts 15, the ruling by the Jerusalem Council that Gentiles could come to Yeshua faith as Gentiles. They did not have to be circumcised, in essence, convert to Judaism before becoming followers of Yeshua. The purpose of this journey was to share the rulings of this Jerusalem Council, that this second journey, of which Paul would eventually end up in the city of Philippi, began in Acts 15 with the message of that Gentiles come to Yeshua faith as Gentiles, and Paul and Timothy were the ones who were going to take that message out to Asia Minor, which is modern day Turkey, and then also go into Macedonia, which is modern day Greece. And when we're introduced in Acts 16 to Timothy, who had been a longtime companion and student of Paul, and we read in Acts 16 verses 1 through 4, it says, Shaul came down to Derbe and went on to Lystra, where there lived a Talmud named Timothy. He was the son of a Jewish woman who had come to trust, and a Greek father. All the brothers in Lystra and Iconium spoke well of Timothy. Shaul wanted Timothy to accompany him, so he took him and did a brit milah because of the Jews living in those areas, where they all knew that his father had been a Greek. As they went out to go through the towns, they delivered to the Jews the decision reached by the emissaries and the elders in Jerusalem for them to observe. In this introduction to Timothy, we see that he was the son of a Greek father and a Jewish mother, and his mother had become a follower of Yeshua. And we'll also see later in the letter to Timothy, 2 Timothy 1:5, that his grandmother Eunice was also a Messianic Jew, making him a third generation Messianic Jew. Though we don't know why Timothy was not circumcised, it appears from the text that his Greek father may have objected to him having his son circumcised, possibly because of the Greek aesthetic ideal of not desecrating the perfect human body by performing circumcision. The Greek ethic was that the human body was perfect in itself, and by doing a brit milah, by circumcising sons, that it would actually be marring their perfect body. So this may be the reason why, as a Greek father, he didn't circumcise his son, even though his son was born to a Jewish mother and was half Jewish of one. So that is so more than likely, even though he had a Jewish mother, his Greek father didn't have him circumcised because of the Greek aversion to circumcision, which they considered mutilation of the perfect human body. To prevent any confusion over Timothy's status as a Jew, because he was born to a Jewish mother, he was Jewish. As Paul and Timothy were going into the Jewish communities of which would be Turkey and Greece today, and not wanting to cause an issue that could disrupt their ministry, of which they could figure, being that Timothy was not circumcised, that there could be some people saying that, oh, there's a Gentile coming into our synagogues and trying to take us away from the Jewish people. Paul circumcised Timothy. So basically, he took Timothy's ambiguous Jewish identity, even though he was born to a Jewish mother, he was not circumcised. So in essence, he did not have the full entrance into the covenant of circumcision. Paul had him circumcised for the sake of there not being any question of his Jewish identity as they went and shared the good news of the Messiah among the Jewish and Gentile populace of the Greek world. Paul demonstrated Timothy's importance to him as a co-worker and disciple by mentioning Timothy in 8 of his letters. And Timothy himself also received 2 letters of Paul, which we know as 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy. So Timothy was very important to Paul. Paul may have included Timothy in his greeting of the letters to indicate that Timothy functioned as a secretary who physically wrote the letter to Paul as was dictated to him, of which Paul in prison would have to dictate his letters. You know, it's believed that Timothy was mentioned here prominently in the greeting the letter, because he was the one who actually wrote down the letter that Paul dictated to him. And Paul also here, in mentioning Timothy, wanted to endorse Timothy as a leader to the Philippian community. Timothy was a young man, a young leader, and Paul here, as the older, deeply respected leader, wants to show to the Philippian community the authority that he has given to Timothy, and that Timothy is bona fide by him as a leader among the Messianic community. Next, we come to the phrase slaves of the Messiah Yeshua. This is an important theme that runs throughout the letter and throughout Paul's life, that he understood himself as a slave of the Messiah Yeshua, a douloi, and him and Timothy together as doulos, that those who are bondservants, those who are totally given over to the Messiah. Paul refers to himself and Timothy as slaves of the Messiah. The self-identification is an essential precursor to one of the essential themes of this book, namely that followers of Yeshua were to model Yeshua's humility and willingness to be a slave, a humble servant willing to give their life for the Messianic community. Paul will use the Greek word for slave, doulos, to refer to Yeshua later in Philippi. Actually, in referring to Yeshua would be douloi, which is the singular version. But the concept of the bond slave, the slave of Hashem. Given the nature of life in the Roman Empire and a major city such as Philippi, the Philippians would be familiar with slavery and what it meant in their society to be a slave. And the use of the word douloi or doulos for slaves to represent himself and Timothy, and later to refer to Yeshua as a douloi, as a slave in the Messianic hymn of chapter 2. Paul is making clear to the Philippians what following Yeshua means, and what the model for their new life as followers of Yeshua entails, a life of being a slave to Messiah, a slave to the God of Israel. The Theological Dictionary of the New Testament says the word doulos meant that the service offered by the slave was performed out of submission and dependence on the master. This description certainly applies to Paul and Timothy, who were entirely devoted to their master and Lord Yeshua. For Paul, being a slave of the Messiah was a wholehearted, joyful act of submission to Yeshua as his Lord. Being a slave of the Messiah was to Paul the realization of true freedom. As we see in Romans 6:22, where he wrote, however, now freed from sin and enslaved to God, you do get the benefit. It consists in being made holy, set apart for God, and its end result is eternal life. Paul's enslavement was no longer to sin and death, but to Yeshua and life, both now and eternally. In his slavery to Yeshua, he was truly free from enslavement to sin. Though it was detrimental to the callings of a slave in Greek and Roman cultures, Paul here is teaching on an important lesson to the Philippians, and to us by extension, on the critical role of being considered a slave of the Messiah, echoing the use of servant as a title of honor for someone chosen for service to the Lord in the Tanakh. We read about in the Tanakh about Moshe Rabbeinu being a servant of an Eved Hashem. We see talking about Joshua and others who use the word Eved, which is the corresponding word to the Hebrew word, which could be considered doulos. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Tanakh, used doulos referring to Moses, Joshua, and David. Evidence, a Hebrew word that was translated as doulos in the above passages, making for a connection between slaves of the Tanakh, those who were slaves of Hashem in the Brit Hadashah, in the Tanakh, Moses, Joshua, David, and others, with the slaves of the Brit Hadashah, Paul, Timothy, and by the example of the believers in Philippi. Paul's devotion to Yeshua is central to his self-identification. All he is, all that life means to him, is being a slave of the Messiah Yeshua. It is in finding himself to the Jewish Messiah that Paul sees meaning in his life, and he stated clearly that his only proper response to his encounter with the Messiah is his objection to him as a slave. His identification as a slave of Messiah motivated him to model Yeshua and commend the same way of life to the Messiah. As Paul was so bound up his whole life in being a follower of Yeshua, being a slave of the Messiah, one who had given their all to the Messiah, and their very life is Messiah, he calls us as modern day followers of Yeshua to understand Yeshua as our life, as the very air that we breathe is to honor Yeshua as our Messiah and honor the God of Israel. So Paul continues on with his introduction of the letter, this first verse. This is to all God's people united with the Messiah and living in Philippi. Paul wrote the letter to the people in Philippi, a city and was now modern country of Greece. It was also the first city in Europe, as I said earlier, where Paul visited and established a Messianic community. There was a minimal Jewish population in Philippi. We actually see in Acts 16 that there wasn't a synagogue. It was one of the first cities that Paul came to share about Messiah with. There wasn't a synagogue, but there were women meeting out at the riverside praying. In essence, that there wasn't a large enough community to have a synagogue, but there were those who were either God-fearers or converts to Judaism, women who were meeting for prayer at the riverside. The phrase "all God people" here is rendered "all God's holy people" in some translations. That in calling these people that he's that more than just all God's people, that all God's holy people. This continues showing the deep love that Paul has for them and his deep respect for them for their following in his ways and his teachings that he passed on to them. And Paul is bringing these Gentiles of Philippi into a life of holiness, walking in a new way of life for them within the context of a Jewish understanding and framework with their Jewish faith, even as they remain Gentiles. So Paul here, in referring to them as holy people, is making them understand that they've come into a new life as followers of Yeshua, as followers of the Messiah. They're leaving their pagan life behind and entering into a new life following the God of Israel, the Messiah of Israel, and living in the context of redeemed Gentiles following in the path of the God of Israel. Interesting enough, this greeting concludes with a line, along with the congregational leaders in Shamashim. Paul makes a point to include in his opening words a greeting to both the congregational leaders and Shamashim, which would be the elders or the deacons of community, those who were the leaders, the spiritual and communal leaders of the body of believers in Philippi. In doing so, Paul has shown there was an established leadership over the community in Philippi, of which Philippi was a Roman colony. It's understood that given that there was the deep culture of following Roman leadership structure, that even in setting up the Messianic community in Philippi, that there was a leadership structure set up for these communities, of which there were the elders, the overseers, those who would be involved in the spiritual leadership of the community, the deacons who would be involved in more of the interpersonal, benevolent work of the community. The role of elders who are sitting was familiar Jewish practice. The original Talmudim of Yeshua would have led in the early Messianic Jewish community, and they were joined by Yaakov, the brother of Yeshua. These elders were to be devoted to the spiritual needs of the community, and to continue this focus, they chose shamashim, or deacons, those who would serve the physical needs of the community. So in this, we see that Paul makes a point of referring to the leadership of the community, along with the general populace of the congregation. And referring to the congregation leaders in this greeting, Paul could be making them aware of his message to the community. In essence, calling out the leaders of this new community of believers, calling them out to realize that they need to listen to and put into practice the teachings that he was giving in this letter. And also, as we'll see later in our study in chapter 4. Chapter 4 begins with Paul referring to a conflict between two of the leaders of the congregation, two women in the congregation, Yodia and Syntyche. So there's also a possibility there is that he was basically making a point to the leaders. I guess some important things in this letter that you need to deal with for the sake of the unity of the community, that there was disunity between leadership, and because of that, there was disunity, and there was a possibility that could leak out and be disunion in the whole community. Though it's understood that a fully formed congregational leadership structure in the Messianic communities would come later, and that's one of the reasons that some people question this letter as being a reference, being written by Paul, is that they question the fact that he talks about there being an established leadership structure, which some believed didn't come about till the second or third century of the Common Era. But clearly we see that there was a eldership and shamashim leadership structure here in Philippi, and Paul is calling them out to let them know that there are important things in this letter for them to hear too, and to pass on to the community. So with that concludes the first verse. We have one verse down, 102 to go. And it has been good being with you. It went a little longer than I was usually planning on going, but there's a lot of stuff in the first verse. The other verses will be more possibly shorter times together. But this was a lot of stuff in this one, packed in this first opening verse of the chapter. So this is the beginning of a daily time together looking at the book of Philippians, and we'll be meeting Monday through Friday, and at 12 p.m. Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern time, and I believe is it 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. Jerusalem time. And as I said, if you'd like more information on this new work, the letter to Philippi organization, you can go to lettertophilippi.org, and you'll find information about the work that we're doing. You'll see our videos as they are posted. I'll be posting this video to the website later today, and each day maybe by the afternoon, if you miss a teaching, it'll be up there. And also you'll be finding our Messianic Jewish book reviews, and continuing other new initiatives we come up. Well, also this teaching I'll be doing is based on my commentary on the book of Philippians that was printed by letter in July of 2019. And you can also go to the website and get a link to purchase the Messianic Jewish commentary on Philippians. And as I said, we were looking to bring these videos to you, and would appreciate if you could support our work financially and also in prayer. And you can, at our website, lettertophilippi.org, you can make a donation to keep this work going on, these daily classes, and also the new things that we're looking to continue to add to in both our teaching and also resource materials that we want to make available for you. So thank you for being with us today. And I will say goodbye for now. Shalom. And thank you for coming to study the book of Philippians with me. This is Sean Emslie from lettertophilippi.org. Letter to Philippi, the Messianic Jewish organization. And goodbye for now, and see you tomorrow at 12 p.m. Pacific time. Shalom.